And so it was that the next day they went out to find Boron. He was a cleric of Montbéliard who, a vagrant like his similars, was now in Paris and a regular visitor to the library of Saint Victoire. And tomorrow he would be God knows where, because he seemed to pursue a plan of his own of which he never spoke with anyone. He had a great head with a mop of hair and eyes reddened from all his reading by lamplight, but he truly seemed an ark of learning. He fascinated them at this first meeting, in a tavern naturally, asking them subtle questions on which their teachers would have spent days and days of disputation. Can sperm freeze? Can a prostitute conceive? Does the sweat of the head stink more than that of other parts of the body? Do the ears flush when one feels shame? Does a man grieve more over the death of a beloved or over her marriage? Must nobles have drooping ears? Do the mad worsen during the full moon? The question that fascinated them most was that of the existence of the vacuum, on which Boron considered himself wiser than any other philosopher. The vacuum, Boron said, his tongue already thick, does not exist, because nature has a horror of it. The fact that it does not exist is evident for philosophical reasons, because if it did exist it would be either substance or accident. It is not material substance, because otherwise it would be body and would occupy space, and it is not incorporeal substance, because otherwise, like the angels, it would be intelligent. It is not accident, because accidents exist only as attributes of substances. In the second place, the vacuum does not exist for physical reasons. Take a cylindrical vessel. But why, Bottolino interrupted, are you so interested in demonstrating that the vacuum does not exist? What does the vacuum matter to you? It matters. Yes, it matters. Because the vacuum can be either interstitial, that is, between one body and another in our sublunar world, or else extended, beyond the universe that we see, closed by the great sphere of the celestial bodies. If that were so, there could perhaps exist, within that vacuum, other worlds. But if it is demonstrated that the interstitial vacuum does not exist, all the more reason why the extended vacuum cannot exist. But what do you care whether other worlds exist? I care. It matters. Because if they did exist, our Lord should have sacrificed himself in each of them, and in each he should have consecrated the bread and the wine. And hence the supreme object, which is testimony and evidence of that miracle, would not be unique, and there would be many copies of it. And what value would my life have if I did not know that, somewhere, there is a supreme object to be found again? And what would this supreme object be? Here Boron tried to truncate the discussion. That's my business, he said, things that are not good for the ears of the profane. Let us speak of something else. If there were so many worlds there would have been so many first humans, so many Adams and so many Eves, who have committed original sin infinite times. And therefore there would be so many earthly paradises from which they were driven. Can you think that something sublime, like the earthly paradise, could exist in so many copies, as there exist so many cities with a river and a hill like that of St. Genevieve? Only one earthly paradise exists, in a remote land, beyond the realm of the Medes and the Persians. They had come to the core of the discussion, and they told Boron of their speculations about Prester John. Yes, Boron had heard a monk talk about this question of the Christian kings of the Orient. He had read the account of a visit, many years ago, by a patriarch of the Indies, to Pope Calixtus II. It told of the effort the Pope had to make to understand his visitor, thanks to the extreme difference of language. The patriarch described the city of Hulna, where a river flows that originates in the earthly paradise, the Physon, which others call the Ganges, and where, on a mountain outside the city, stands the sanctuary containing the body of the Apostle Thomas. This mountain was inaccessible because it rose in the center of a lake, but for 8 days every year the waters of the lake withdraw, and the good Christians of the region can go and worship the body of the Apostle, still intact as if he were not dead, but, rather, as the text described him, with a star's shining face, red hair falling to his shoulders, a beard, and garments that seemed just sewn. But nothing tells us that this patriarch is Prester John, Boron concluded cautiously. No, of course not, Bottolino replied, but it tells us that for a long time there has been talk about some distant region, blessed and unknown. Listen to me. In his Historia de Duibus Civitatibus, my beloved Bishop Otto reported that a certain Hugo of Jabala once said that John, after defeating the Persians, tried to go to the aid of the Christians in the Holy Land, but was forced to stop on the banks of the Tigris because he had no vessels to carry his men across. So John lives beyond the Tigris. Am I right? But the great thing is that everyone must have known this even before Hugo spoke of him. Let's reread carefully what Otto wrote, and he did not write at random. Why should this Hugo have to explain to the Pope the reasons John had been unable to assist the Christians of Jerusalem? Why should Hugo have to justify John? Obviously because in Rome there were those already nursing this hope. And when Otto says that Hugo mentions John, he adds sic enim eum nominare solent, as they generally called him. Why did he use this verb in the plural? Clearly not only Hugo but also others solent are accustomed to, and hence already in those days that was what they called him. Further, Otto writes how Hugo affirms that John, like the Magi from whom he was descended, wanted to go to Jerusalem, but then Otto doesn't write that Hugo asserts John did not succeed, but rather, that for Tor, it is reported, and that some, others, in the plural, asserunt, assert that he did not succeed. We are learning from our masters that there is no better proof of the truth, Bottolino concluded, than the continuity of the tradition. Abdul whispered in Bottolino's ear that perhaps Bishop Otto also occasionally took a little green honey, but Bottolino jabbed an elbow into his ribs. I still don't understand why this priest is so important to you, Boron said, but if he has to be sought, it must not be along a river that comes from the earthly paradise, but, rather, in the earthly paradise itself. And on this point I would have many things to say. Bottolino and Abdul tried to press Boron to tell them more about the earthly paradise, but Boron had abused the hogsheads of Lestois chandeliers, and said he could no longer remember anything. As if they had had the same thought and without saying a word to each other, the two friends grasped Boron under the armpits and carried him to their room. There, Abdul, though with some parsimony, offered their guest a touch of green honey on the tip of a spoon, and they shared another drop. Boron, after remaining stunned for a moment, looking around as if unable to grasp precisely where he was, began to see something of paradise. He spoke, and he told of a certain Tugdalus, who seemed to have visited hell and paradise. The nature of hell was not worth talking about, but paradise was a place filled with charity, joy, gaiety, honesty, beauty, holiness, harmony, unity, charity, and eternity without end, defended by a golden wall beyond which you could discern many chairs decorated with precious stones, with men and women seated there, young and old, dressed in silken stoles, their faces glowing like the sun, with hair of purest gold, and all singing Alleluia, reading from a book illuminated with golden letters. Now, Boron said sensibly, to hell all can go, you have only to wish it, and sometimes those who have been there come back to tell us something of it, in the form of incubus or succubus, or some other troubling vision. But can you really believe that someone who has seen these things has been admitted to the heavenly paradise? Even if that had happened, no living person would have the immodesty to recount it, because there are some mysteries that a modest and virtuous person should keep to himself. God grant that never on the face of the earth such a person, corroded by vanity, appear, Bottolino commented, to prove unworthy of the trust the Lord has bestowed on him. Now then, Boron said, you must have heard the story of Alexander the Great, who arrived on the shore of the Ganges and supposedly reached a wall that followed the course of the river but had no gate, and after 3 days of sailing he saw in the wall a little window, at which an old man was looking out. The travelers asked that the city pay a tribute to Alexander, King of Kings, but the old man replied that this was the city of the blessed. It is impossible that Alexander, great king but a pagan, had arrived at the celestial city, and therefore what he and Tugdalus had seen was the earthly paradise. What I see at this moment, where, there, and he pointed to a corner of the room. I see a place where meadows extend, lovely and green, decked with flowers and scented grasses, while all around a sweet odor wafts, and, breathing it, I feel no more desire for food or for drink. There is a most beautiful lawn, with 4 men of venerable aspect, crowns of gold on their heads and palm fronds in their hands. I hear singing, I sense a balsamic aroma, oh my God, I taste in my mouth a sweetness as of honey. I see a church of crystal, with an altar in its midst from which flows water white as milk. The church, from the north, seems a precious stone, on its austral side it is blood-colored, to the west white as snow, and above it shine countless stars more splendid than those in our sky. I see a man with hair white as snow, beplumed as a bird, his eyes almost indiscernible, covered as they are by snowy, drooping lashes. He points out to me a tree that never ages and cures of any ill one who sits in its shade, and another with leaves all the colors of the rainbow. But why am I seeing these things this evening? Perhaps you have read of them somewhere, and the wine has brought them to the surface of your soul, Abdul said then. That virtuous man who came from my island, St. Brendan, sailed the seas to the farthest confines of the earth, and discovered an island all covered with ripe grapes, some blue, some purple, others white, with 7 miraculous fountains and 7 churches, one of crystal, another of garnet, the 3rd of sapphire, the 4th of topaz, the 5th of ruby, the 6th of emerald, the 7th of coral, each with 7 altars and 7 lamps. And before the church, in the middle of a square, rose a column of chalcedon with, at its top, a turning wheel covered with rattles. Ah, no, mine is not an island. Boron flared up. It's a land close to India, where I see men with ears larger than ours, and a double tongue, so that they can speak with 2 people at once. And many crops. It seems they grow spontaneously. Of course, Bottolino glossed, we must remember that according to Exodus the people of God were promised a land dripping with milk and honey. Let's not confuse things, Abdul said. In Exodus it's the promised land, promised after the fall, whereas the earthly paradise was the land of our forefathers before the fall. Abdul, this isn't a disputatio. Here it's not a question of identifying a place where we will go, but of understanding the nature of the ideal place where each of us would like to go. It's obvious that if such marvels existed and still exist, not only in the earthly paradise but also on islands where Adam and Eve never set foot, the kingdom of Prester John must be very similar to those places. We are trying to understand what a kingdom of abundance and virtue is like, where falsehood does not exist, nor greed nor lust. Otherwise why should one be drawn to it as to the supreme Christian kingdom? But there must be no exaggerating, Abdul wisely insisted. Otherwise nobody would believe in it anymore. I mean, nobody would believe anymore that it is possible to go so far. He said, far. Shortly before, Bottolino believed that, in imagining the earthly paradise, Abdul had forgotten, for one evening at least, his impossible passion. But no, he thought of it still. He was seeing the paradise, but in it he was looking for his princess. In fact, he murmured, as the honey's effect slowly faded, perhaps one day we will go longen li jorn long en May, you know, in May when the days are long. Boron began to laugh softly. There, Master Nikitas, Bottolino said, when I was not prey to the temptations of this world, I devoted my nights to imagining other worlds. A bit with the help of wine, and a bit with that of the green honey. There is nothing better than imagining other worlds, he said, to forget the painful one we live in. At least so I thought then. I hadn't yet realized that, imagining other worlds, you end up changing this one. Let's try for the present to live serenely in this one, where the divine will has placed us, Nikitas said. Now that our incomparable Genoese have prepared for us some delicacies of our cuisine. Taste this soup of different varieties of fish, from fresh water and from the sea. Perhaps you have good fish also in your parts, though I imagine that your intense cold does not allow them to grow plentifully, as in the Propontis. We season the soup with onions cooked in olive oil, with fennel and herbs, and 2 glasses of dry wine. You pour it on these slices of bread, and then you put in some avgolaminos, which is this sauce of egg yolks and lemon juice, diluted in a hint of broth. I believe that in the earthly paradise Adam and Eve ate like this. But before original sin, afterwards, perhaps they resigned themselves to eating tripe, as in Paris. 9. Bottolino upbraids the emperor and seduces the empress. Bottolino, among his not very rigorous studies and his fantasies on the Garden of Eden, had now spent 4 winters in Paris. He was eager to see Frederick again and, even more, Beatrice, who in his giddy spirit had now lost every earthly feature and had become an inhabitant of paradise, like Abdul's distant princess. One day Reynaud asked the poet to provide an ode to the emperor. The poet, desperate, tried to gain time by saying to his master that he was awaiting proper inspiration, then sent off to Bottolino a request for help. Bottolino wrote an excellent poem, Salve Mundi Domini, in which Frederick was set above all other kings, and which said that his yoke was most sweet. But unwilling to entrust it to a messenger, he decided to return to Italy, where meanwhile many things had happened, which he had difficulty summing up for Nikitas. Reynaud had devoted his life to creating an image of the emperor as Lord of the world, Prince of Peace, source of all law and subject to none, at the same time Rex et Sacerdos, like Melchizedek, and therefore he could not avoid conflict with the Pope. Now, at the time of the siege of Crema, Hadrian, the Pope who had crowned Frederick in Rome, died, and the majority of the cardinals elected Cardinal Bandinelli as Alexander III. For Reynaud this was a calamity, because with Bandinelli it was cats and dogs, and the new pope would not yield on the question of papal supremacy. I don't know what Reynaud schemed, but he managed to ensure that some cardinals and people of the Senate elected a different pope, Victor IV, whom he and Frederick could maneuver as they wished. Naturally Alexander III immediately excommunicated both Frederick and Victor, and it did not suffice to say that Alexander was not the true pope and thus his excommunication was worthless, because on the one hand the kings of France and England were inclined to recognize him, and on the other hand for the Italian cities it was an unexpected boon to find a pope who said that the emperor was a schismatic and hence no one owed him obedience. Further, news arrived that Alexander was plotting with your Basileus Manuel, seeking support from an empire greater than Frederick's. If Reynaud wanted Frederick to be the sole heir of the Roman Empire, he had to find the visible proof of a lineage. That's why he had also set the poet to work. Nikitas had some trouble following Bottolino's story year by year. Not only did it seem to him that his narrator was a bit confused about what had happened before and what had happened after, but he also found that Frederick's exploits were repeated, always the same, and he could no longer understand when the Milanese had taken up arms again, when they had again threatened Lodi, or when the emperor had again come down into Italy. If this were a chronicle, he said to himself, it would suffice to take any page at random and you would find there the same deeds. It's like one of those dreams where the same story keeps recurring, and you long to wake up. In any case it seemed to Nikitas that for 2 years now the Milanese had created trouble for Frederick with spiteful acts and skirmishes, and the following year the emperor, with the support of Novara, Asti, Vercelli, the Marquis of Monferrato, the Marquis Malaspina, the Count of Biandrate, with Como, Lodi, Bergamo, Cremona, Pavia, and some others, had again laid siege to Milan. One fine spring morning Bottolino, now 20, bearing his Salve Mundi Domini for the poet and his correspondence with Beatrice, which he would not leave in Paris at the mercy of thieves, arrived at the walls of that city. I hope that Frederick behaved better in Milan than at Crema, Nikitas said. Even worse, according to what I heard on arriving. He had had the eyes gouged out of 6 prisoners from Melzo and Roncate, whereas with one Milanese he had torn out a single eye, so that the man could lead the others back to Milan, but in compensation he had cut off that prisoner's nose. And when he captured men trying to deliver provisions to Milan, he had their hands cut off. So you see? He also gouged out eyes. But with common people, not with lords, the way your rulers do. And they were his enemies, not his relatives. Are you justifying him? Now I am. Not then. Then I was outraged. I didn't want even to meet him. But I had to go and pay him homage. I couldn't avoid it. The emperor, on seeing him after such a long time, was about to embrace him with great joy, but Bottolino was unable to control himself. He drew back, wept, said the emperor was wicked, that he couldn't claim to be the source of justice if he then acted unjustly, that he was ashamed of being his son. If anyone else had said such things to him, Frederick would have ordered not only his eyes gouged and his nose cut off, but also his ears severed. Instead, he was impressed by Bottolino's ire, and he, the emperor, tried to justify himself. It's rebellion, rebellion against the law, Bottolino, and you were the first to tell me that I am the law. I cannot pardon, I cannot be good. It is my duty to be merciless. You think I like it? Yes, you like it, my father. Did you have to kill all those people 2 years ago at Crema and mutilate these others in Milan, not in battle, but in cold blood, for a question of pride, a vengeance, an affront? Ah, you follow my actions as if you were a human. Then let me tell you it was not a question of pride, it was an example. It's the only way to subdue these disobedient sons. Do you think that Caesar and Augustus were more clement? It's war, Bottolino. Do you know what that is, you who act the great scholar? Do you, in Paris, realize that when you return here I will want you at court among my ministers, and perhaps I will even make you a knight? And do you think you will ride with the Holy Roman Emperor and not soil your hands? Does blood revolt you? Then tell me so and I'll have you made a monk. Then you'll have to be chaste, mind you, though I've been told stories about you in Paris that make it hard for me to see you as a religious. Where did you get that scar? I'm amazed that you have it on your face and not on your ass. Your spies may have told you stories about me in Paris, but I, with no need of spies, have heard on all sides a fine story about you at Adrianople. Better my stories with Parisian husbands than yours with the Byzantine monks. Frederick stiffened and turned pale. He knew very well what Bottolino meant. The youth had heard it from Otto. When Frederick was still Duke of Swabia, he had taken up the cross and participated in the second expedition to go to the aid of the Christian reign in Jerusalem. And as the Christian army was advancing, with great difficulty, near Adrianople, one of his noblemen, who had become separated from the expedition, was attacked and killed, perhaps by local bandits. There was already great tension between Latins and Byzantines, and Frederick took the incident as an affront. As at Crema, his wrath became uncontrollable. He attacked a nearby monastery and slaughtered all the monks. The episode had remained a blot on Frederick's name. Everyone pretended to forget it, and even Otto, in his Gesta Friederici, remained silent about it, mentioning instead immediately afterwards how the young duke escaped a violent flood not far from Constantinople, a sign that heaven had not revoked its protection. Frederick's pallor turned to a flush. He seized a bronze candlestick and flung himself on Bottolino as if to kill him. He barely restrained himself, lowering the weapon when he had already seized the youth by his coat, and said to him through clenched teeth, "By all the devils of hell, never repeat what you have said." Before leaving the tent, he turned for an instant. "Go and pay homage to the Empress, then back to your milksop clerics in Paris." "I'll show you if I'm a milksop, I'll show you what I can do," Bottolino muttered, leaving the field. He did not know what he could do, yet he felt hatred towards his adoptive father and wanted to harm him. Still furious, he reached Beatrice's quarters. He dutifully kissed the hem of her dress, then her hand. She was surprised by the scar, and asked anxious questions. Nonchalantly, Bottolino answered that there had been a brawl with some highway thieves. Such things happen when you travel the world. Beatrice looked at him with admiration, and it must be said that this 20-year-old, with his leonine face made even more virile by the scar, was by now what you would call a fine figure of a knight. The Empress bade him be seated and invited him to tell her of his latest deeds. As the Empress, smiling, went on with her embroidery, sitting under a pretty canopy, he crouched at her feet and talked, on, not even knowing what he was saying, simply to calm his tension. Little by little, as he spoke, he noticed, glancing up, the beautiful face, and he felt again all the ardor of those years, multiplied 100 times over, until Beatrice said to him, with one of her most seductive smiles, "You haven't ridden as much as I ordered you to, or as often as I would have wished." Perhaps she said it with her usual sisterly solicitude, perhaps she wanted only to animate the conversation, but for Bottolino anything Beatrice said was at once balm and toxin. With trembling hands, he drew from his bosom his letters to her and hers to him and, holding them out to her, murmured, "No, I have written, and very often, and you, my lady, have answered me." Beatrice did not understand. She took the pages, began to read them in a low voice in order better to decipher that double calligraphy. Bottolino, 2 paces from her, wrung his hands, sweating, told himself he was mad, that she would send him away, calling her guards. He wished he had a weapon to plunge into his heart. Beatrice continued reading, and her cheeks grew increasingly flushed, her voice trembled as she spelled out those inflamed words, as if she were celebrating a blasphemous mass. She stood up, once, twice she seemed to sway. Twice she waved off Bottolino, who had risen to support her. Then in a faint voice she said only, "Oh, child, what have you done?" Bottolino stepped closer, to take those pages from her hand, all a-tremble. She reached out to stroke the back of his neck. He turned his head aside because he was unable to look into her eyes. She stroked his scar with her fingertips. To avoid that touch, too, he again moved his head, but by now she had come closer, and they found themselves nose to nose. Bottolino put his hands behind his back, to prohibit himself an embrace, but now their lips had touched, and after touching they parted slightly, so for an instant, only one instant of the very few that the kiss lasted, through their parted lips their tongues also met. As that swift eternity ended, Beatrice drew back, now white, as if ill, and, fixing Bottolino's eyes, harshly, she said to him, "By all the saints in paradise, never do again what you have done." She said this without wrath, almost without emotion, as if she were about to faint. Then her eyes became moist and she added, sweetly, "I beg you." Bottolino knelt, almost grazing the ground with his forehead, and left, with no conscious direction. Later he realized that in a single instant he had committed 4 crimes. He had offended the majesty of the empress, he had stained himself with adultery, he had betrayed the trust of his father, and he had given way to the insidious temptation of revenge. Revenge, why? He asked himself. If Frederick had not committed that massacre, had not insulted me, and I had not felt hatred in my heart, would I still have done what I did? In trying not to reply to this question, he realized that, if the answer were what he feared, then he would have committed the 5th and most horrible of sins. He would have indelibly besmirched the virtue of his idol only to satisfy his rancor. He would have transformed the meaning of his existence into a sordid weapon. Master Nikitas, this suspicion has accompanied me for many years, even if I could never forget the heartrending beauty of that moment. I was ever more in love, but this time with no hope, not even in my dreams. Because if I wanted any kind of forgiveness, her image had to vanish from my dreams, too. After all, I said to myself during many long, sleepless nights, you have had everything, and you can desire nothing else. Night was falling on Constantinople, and the sky was no longer reddening. The fire by now was dying out, and only on some city hills could you see a glow, not of flames but of embers. Nikitas meanwhile had ordered 2 cups of honeyed wine. Bottolino sipped it, his eyes lost in the void. It's wine from Thassos. Sweet, isn't it? Nikitas asked. Very sweet, Bottolino replied, as he seemed to be thinking of other things. Then he set down the cup. That same evening, he concluded, I forever renounced judging Frederick, because I felt more guilty than he. Is it worse to cut off the nose of an enemy or to kiss the mouth of your benefactor's wife? The next day he went and asked his adoptive father's forgiveness for the harsh words he had said, and he blushed on realizing that it was Frederick who felt remorse. The emperor embraced him, apologizing for his wrath, and saying that he preferred, to the 100 flatterers he had around him, a son like this, capable of telling him when he was wrong. Not even my confessor has the courage to tell me that, Frederick said, smiling. You are the only person I trust. Bottolino began paying for his crime, with burning shame. 10. Bottolino finds the Magi and canonizes Charlemagne. Bottolino arrived at Milan when the Milanese were at the end of their strength, partly because of their internal arguments. In the end, they sent delegations to agree on the surrender, and the conditions were still those established by the Diet of Roncaglia, which meant that after 4 years, and with so many dead and such devastation, they were right where they had been 4 years earlier. But it was a surrender more shameful than the preceding one. Frederick would have liked again to grant his pardon, but Reynald, implacable, fanned the flames. A lesson had to be taught, which no one would ever forget, and the other cities had to be satisfied, those that had fought alongside the emperor, not out of love for him but out of hatred for Milan. Bottolino, the emperor said, this time you mustn't oppose me. There are times when an emperor must do what his counselors want. And he added, lowering his voice, that Reynald frightens me more than the Milanese. So he ordered Milan erased from the face of the earth, and had everyone, men and women, sent out of the city. The fields surrounding the city now teemed with Milanese roaming aimlessly about. Some sought refuge in neighboring cities, others remained encamped below the walls, hoping that the emperor would pardon them and allow them to go back inside. It was raining, the refugees shivered with cold during the night, the children fell ill, the men by now were disarmed, huddled along the edge of the roads, shaking their fists at the heavens, for it was wiser to curse the Almighty than the emperor, since the emperor had his men patrolling and demanding explanations for any violent lamentation. Frederick had first tried to annihilate the rebel city by setting it on fire, then he had thought it better to leave the matter in the hands of the Italians, who hated Milan more than he did. He assigned the Lodi forces the task of destroying the whole quarter at the eastern gate known as Porta Renza, the Cremonesi were to destroy Porta Romana, the Pavesi should raze to the ground Porta Vercellina, and the Comasques should destroy Porta Comacina, while the men of Seprio and Martesana should reduce Porta Nuova to a single ruin. The task greatly pleased the men of those cities, who indeed had paid the emperor much money to enjoy the privilege of settling with their own hands their scores with defeated Milan. The day after the beginning of the demolition, Bottolino ventured inside the girdle of the walls. In certain places nothing could be seen, except a great dust cloud. Entering the cloud, he could discern here a group of men, who had tied heavy ropes to a facade, pulling in unison until it collapsed. There, expert masons on the roof of a church swinging their picks until the roof was gone, and then with great mallets breaking the walls, or uprooting the columns by inserting wedges at their base. Bottolino spent a few days wandering through the convulsed streets. He saw the spire of the main church crumble, the most beautiful and mighty of all Italy. The most zealous were the Lodigiani, who sought only revenge. They were the first to demolish their assigned area, then they rushed to assist the Cremonesi in leveling Porta Romana. But the Pavesi seemed the most expert. They struck no random blows, and they controlled their rage. They scraped away the mortar wherever the stones were joined together, or else they dug at the foot of the walls until the rest collapsed. In short, for anyone who did not understand what was going on, Milan seemed a merry workplace, where everyone labored with alacrity, praising the Lord. Except that it was as if time ran backwards. It seemed that from the void a new city was rising, when instead an ancient city was returning to dust and bare earth. Absorbed in these thoughts, Bottolino, on Easter Day, when the emperor had decreed great celebrations in Pavia, hastened to discover the Mirabilia Urbis Mediolani while Milan still existed. So he happened to pass a splendid basilica still intact, and to see in the vicinity some pavesi who were completing the demolition of a little palace, hard at work even on this holy day of obligation. He learned from them that this was the basilica of Sant'Estorgio, and that the following day they would devote their attentions to it. It's too beautiful to be left standing, isn't it? One of the destroyers said to him persuasively. Bottolino entered the nave of the basilica, cool, silent, and empty. The altars and the side chapels had already been demolished. Some dogs had arrived from God knows where to find this welcoming place, and had made it their inn, pissing at the base of the columns. Beside the main altar a cow roamed, moaning. She was a handsome animal, and Bottolino was led to ponder the hatred that drove the destroyers of the city to overlook such appetizing booty in their haste to level the city. In a side chapel, beside a stone sarcophagus, he saw an old priest emitting sobs of despair, or, rather, chirps like a wounded animal. His face was whiter than the white of his eyes, and his wasted body twitched at every lament. Bottolino tried to help, offering him the flask of water he was carrying. "Thank you, good Christian," the old man said, "but now I can only wait for death." "They won't kill you," Bottolino said to him. "The siege is over, the peace has been signed. Those men outside want only to knock down your church, not take your life. And what will my life be without my church? This is heaven's just punishment, because in my ambition, many years ago, I wanted my church to be the most famous and most beautiful of all, and I committed a sin." "What sin could that poor old man have committed?" Bottolino asked him. "Years ago an oriental traveler suggested I buy from him the most splendid relics of Christianity, the uncorrupted bodies of the three magi." "The magi? All three of them? Intact?" "Three, magi, and intact. They seem alive, that is, I mean they seem barely dead." I knew it couldn't be true, because the magi are spoken of in only one gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, and he says very little about them. He doesn't say how many there were, where they came from, whether they were kings or wise men. He says only that they reached Jerusalem following a star. No Christian knows what their origin was or where they returned to. Who could have found their grave? For this reason I never dared tell the Milanese I was concealing this treasure. I was afraid that, out of greed, they would seize the opportunity to attract the faithful from all Italy, gaining money from a false relic. Therefore you didn't sin. I sinned because I kept them hidden in this consecrated place. I kept waiting for a sign from heaven, and it did not come. Now I don't want these vandals to find them. They might divide up the treasure to confer an extraordinary dignity on some of the very cities that today are destroying us. Please, get rid of every trace of my past weakness. Seek help, come before evening and take away these dubious relics. With little effort you can surely win paradise, and to me that seems no small thing." You see, Master Nikitas, I remembered then that Otto had spoken to me about the Magi in connection with Prester John. To be sure, if that poor old priest had displayed them as if they had appeared from nowhere, nobody would have believed him. But does a relic, to be true, have to date back to the saint or to the event of which it was part? No, of course not. Many relics that are preserved here in Constantinople are of very suspect origin, but the worshipper who kisses them perceives supernatural aromas wafting from them. It is faith that makes them true, not they who make faith true. Precisely. I also thought that a relic is valid if it finds its proper place in a true story. Outside the story of Prester John, those magi could have been the trick of some rug merchant. Within the true story of John they became genuine testimony. A door is not a door if it does not have a building around it, otherwise it would be only a hole. No, what am I saying? Not even a hole, because a void without something surrounding it is not a void. I understood then that I had the story in which the magi could have a meaning. I thought that if I said something about Prester John to the emperor to lure him to the Orient, having the confirmation of the magi, who surely came from the Orient, would support my argument. These poor three kings were asleep in their sarcophagus, letting the Pavesi and the Lodigiani tear to pieces the city that unwittingly housed them. They owed it nothing, they were only there in transit, as at an inn, waiting to go elsewhere. After all, they were rovers by nature. Hadn't they set out from God knows where to follow a star? It was up to me to give those three bodies a new Bethlehem. Bottolino knew that a good relic could change the fate of a city, cause it to become the destination of uninterrupted pilgrimage, transform a simple church into a shrine. Who might be interested in the Magi? Reynald came to mind. He had been given the Archbishopric of Cologne, but he had still to go there for his official consecration. To enter one's own cathedral with the three Magi would be a great deed. Was Reynald looking for symbols of imperial power? Here he had, within reach, not one but three kings, who had also been priests. He asked the old man if he could see the bodies. The priest required Bottolino's help, because they had to shift the lid of the sarcophagus until they had uncovered the box in which the bodies were kept. It was hard work, but it was worth it. Oh wonder, the bodies of the three kings seemed still alive, even though the skin had dried and become like parchment. But it had not darkened, as happens with mummified bodies. Two of the Magi had faces almost milky, one with a great white beard down to his chest, the beard still intact even if stiffened, like spun sugar. The second was beardless. The third was the color of ebony, not because of the passing of time, but because he must have had dark skin while still alive. He seemed a wooden statue, and even had a kind of crack in his left cheek. He had a short beard and a pair of fleshy lips, bared to reveal only 2 teeth, feral and white. All 3 were staring, their great, dazed eyes wide, the pupils glistening like glass. They were enfolded in cloaks, one white, one green, and one purple, and from the cloaks trousers emerged, in barbarian style, but of pure damask embroidered with rows of pearls. Baudolino quickly returned to the imperial encampment and rushed to speak with Reynald. The chancellor realized at once the value of Baudolino's discovery, and said, "It must all be done in secret and quickly. We can't carry away the box, it would be too noticeable. If someone else here were to be aware of what you have found, he wouldn't hesitate to steal it from us, to take it to his own city. I'll have 3 coffins made, of plain wood, and during the night we'll carry them outside the walls, saying they contain the bodies of 3 dear friends fallen in the siege. There will be just you, the poet, and a servant of mine. Then we'll leave them where we put them, without haste. Before I can take them to Cologne, authentic documentation will have to be produced, regarding the origin of the relics and of the Magi themselves. Tomorrow you will return to Paris, where you know learned people, and you will find out whatever you can about their story." During the night the 3 kings were carried to a crypt in the church of San Giorgio, outside the walls. Reynald wanted to see them, and he then exploded in a series of imprecations unworthy of an archbishop. "With these breeches? And this cap that looks a jester's? Lord Reynald, apparently this is how they dressed then, the wise men of the Orient. Years ago I was in Ravenna and I saw a mosaic where on the robe of the Empress Theodora the 3 Magi are depicted more or less like this. Exactly, things that can convince the Greeklings of Byzantium. But can you imagine me presenting myself in Cologne with the Magi dressed like buffoons? We must change their clothes." "How?" the poet asked. "How? I've allowed you to eat and drink like a feudal lord for writing 2 or 3 verses a year, and you don't know how to dress those who first adored our Lord Jesus Christ. Dress them the way people imagined they were dressed, like bishops, like a pope, an archimandrite. Do it. The cathedral and the bishopric have been sacked. Maybe we can recover some holy vestments." "I'll try," the poet said. It was a terrible night. The vestments were found, and also something resembling 3 tiaras, but the problem was to strip the 3 mummies. While the faces seemed still alive, the bodies, except the hands, totally desiccated, were reduced to a framework of withes and straw, which came apart at every attempt to remove the clothing. "No matter," Reynald said, "once the box is in Cologne, nobody will open it. Put some sticks inside, anything that will keep them straight, the way you do with scarecrows. With all due reverence, mind you. Dear Lord Jesus," the poet complained, "even in my most drunken state would I ever have imagined I'd be sticking anything up a Magi's ass?" "Shut up and dress them," Baudolino said. "We're working for the glory of the empire." The poet let out some horrible blasphemies, but the Magi finally looked like cardinals of the Holy Roman Apostolic Church. The next day Baudolino set forth on his journey. In Paris, Abdul, who knew a great deal about matters of the Orient, put him in touch with a canon of Saint Victoire, who knew even more. The Magi," he said. "Tradition refers to them constantly, and many of the fathers have spoken of them, but 3 of the Gospels are silent on the subject, and the quotations from Isaiah and other prophets are unrevealing. Some have read them as referring to the Magi, but they could have been referring to something else. Who were they? What were their real names? Some say Hormizd of Seleucia, king of Persia, Jazdegerd and Peraz, kings of Sheba. Others say Hor, Basander, Karundas. But according to other, highly credible authors, they are called Melkon, Gaspar, and Balthasar, or else Melko, Caspar, and Fatizarda, or even Megalath, Galgalath, and Saracen, or perhaps Apellius, Amorus, and Damascus. Apellius and Damascus are beautiful, they suggest distant lands, Abdul said, looking vaguely into space. And why not Karundas? Baudolino rebutted. We're not here to find 3 names that please you, we want 3 real names. The canon continued. I would tend towards Bithysaria, Melichior, and Gastafa. The first was king of Godolia and Sheba. The second, king of Nubia and Arabia. The third, king of Tharsis and the island of Yggdrasil. Did they know one another before undertaking the journey? No. They met in Jerusalem and miraculously recognized one another. But some say they were wise men who lived on Mount Victorial or Mount Voss, from whose peak they studied the signs in the heavens, and to Mount Victorial they returned after the visit to Jesus, and later they joined the Apostle Thomas to evangelize the Indies, except that they were 12, not 3. 12 Magi? Isn't that too many? Even John Chrysostom says as much. According to others, their names would be Jerned, Hwrmzd, Awstsp, Arsk, Zernt, Ariv, Arthsist, Astnbwzn, Mhrwq, Ahsrs, Nsrdyh, and Mrwdk. But you have to be careful, because Origen says that there were 3 of them, like the sons of Noah, and 3 like the 3 Indias from which they came. There may well have been 12 Magi, Baudolino remarked, but in Milan 3 were found, and we have to construct an acceptable story based on 3. Let's say they were called Balthasar, Melchior, and Caspar, which seem to me names more easily pronounced than those awful sneezes our venerable master emitted just now. The problem is, how did they arrive in Milan? It doesn't seem a problem to me, the canon said, since they did arrive there. I'm convinced that their grave was found on Mount Victorial by Queen Helen, the mother of Constantine. A woman capable of finding the true cross would also have been able to discover the true magi. And Helen took the bodies to Constantinople, to Saint Sophia. No, no. Otherwise the Emperor of the Orient will want to know how we took them away from him, said Abdul. Never fear, said the canon. If they were in the Basilica of Sant'Estorgio, surely that sainted man had brought them there, when he set out from Byzantium to occupy the bishop's seat in Milan at the time of the Emperor Mauritius, and long before Charlemagne lived in our land. Eustorgio couldn't have stolen the Magi, so he must have received them as a gift from the basileus of the Empire of the Orient. With such a well-constructed story, Bottolino returned at the year's end to Reynald and reminded him that, according to Otto, the Magi were surely ancestors of Prester John, whom they had invested with their dignity and function. Whence came the power of Prester John over all three Indias, or at least over one of them? Reynald had completely forgotten those words of Otto, but on hearing mention of a priest who ruled over an empire, a king with priestly functions, pope and monarch at the same time, he was now convinced he had put Alexander III in difficulties. The Magi kings and priests. King and priest John. What a wondrous figure, allegory, augury, prophecy, herald of that imperial dignity that Reynald, step by step, was creating around Frederick. Bottolino, he said at once, I'll deal with the Magi now. You must think about Prester John. From what you tell me, for the moment we have only rumors, and that's not enough. We need a document that will attest to his existence, that says who he is, where he is, how he lives. And where will I find that? If you can't find it, make it. The Emperor has allowed you to study, and this is the moment to put your talents to use. And to win yourself knighthood, just as soon as you have ended your studies, which, if you ask me, have gone on too long. You understand, Master Nikitas? Bottolino said. Now Prester John for me had become a duty, not a game. And I was to seek him no longer in memory of Otto, but to obey an order of Reynolds. As my father, Gagliardo, used to say, I've always been contrary by nature. If I'm ordered to do something, I promptly lose any desire to do it. I obeyed Reynald and went immediately back to Paris, but it was to avoid having to encounter the Empress. Abdul had resumed writing songs, and I noticed the pot of green honey was now half empty. I talked to him again about the adventure of the Magi, and he strummed his instrument and chanted. Let no one be amazed if I, love her who will never see me. My heart knows no other love, except for what I have never seen, nor can any other joy make me laugh, and I know not what good will come to me, ha, ha. Ha ha, I gave up arguing with him about my plans and, as far as Prester John was concerned, for about a year I did nothing more. And the Magi? Reynald took the relics to Cologne 2 years later, but he was generous. Some time back he had been provost of the Cathedral of Hildesheim, and so before sealing the remains of the kings in their box in Cologne, he had a finger cut from each one and sent them, as a donation, to his old church. However, in that same period, Reynald had to resolve other problems, and not small ones. Just 2 months before he could celebrate his triumph in Cologne, the antipope, Victor, died. Almost everyone heaved a sigh of relief. This would automatically put things back in order, and perhaps Frederick would have a reconciliation with Alexander. But it was that schism that kept Reynald alive. You understand, Master Nikitas? With 2 popes he counted for more than with 1 pope. So he invented a new antipope, Paschal III, organizing a parody of the conclave with a few ecclesiastics he collected practically off the street. Frederick wasn't convinced. He said to me, you had gone back to him? Bottolino sighed. Yes, for a few days. In that same year the Empress had borne Frederick a son. What did you feel? I realized I had to forget her definitively. I fasted for 7 days, drinking only water, because I had read somewhere that it purifies the spirit, and in the end provokes visions. Is that true? Very true. But the visions were of her. Then I decided I had to see that baby, to establish the difference between the dream and the vision. So I went back to court. More than 2 years had gone by since that magnificent and awful day, and since then we had never seen each other. I told myself then that, even if I couldn't resign myself to loving Beatrice as a mother, I would consider that child a brother. But I looked at that little thing in the cradle, and I couldn't dispel the thought that, if matters had gone just a little differently, he could have been my son. In any case I still risked feeling incestuous. Frederick meanwhile was troubled by quite different problems. He said to Reynald that half a pope was scant guarantee of his rights, that the Magi were all well and good, but they weren't enough, because having found the Magi did not necessarily mean being descended from them. The pope, lucky man, could trace his origins back to Peter, and Peter had been designated by Jesus himself, but what could the Holy and Roman Emperor do? Trace his origins to Caesar, who was, after all, a pagan. Bottolino then pulled out the first idea that came into his head, namely, that Frederick could have his origins date back to Charlemagne. But Charlemagne was anointed by the pope. So we're back where we started, Frederick replied. Unless you have him made a saint, Bottolino said. Frederick admonished him to think before he uttered nonsense. It's not nonsense, replied Bottolino, who had not so much thought as visualized the scene that his idea could engender. Listen. You go to Aix-la-Chapelle, to Charlemagne's tomb, you have his remains exhumed, you put them in a fine reliquary in the midst of the Palatine Chapel and, in your presence, with a suite of loyal bishops, including Master Reynald, who as Archbishop of Cologne is also the Metropolitan of that province, and with a bull from Pope Paschal that legitimizes you, you proclaim Charlemagne saint. You understand? You proclaim saint the founder of the Holy Roman Empire. Once he is a saint he is superior to the Pope, and you, as his legitimate successor, are of the race of a saint, freed from any authority, even that of one who claims to excommunicate you. By Charlemagne's beard, Frederick said, the hairs of his own beard bristling with excitement. Did you hear that, Reynald? As always, the boy is right. And so it happened, even though not until the end of the following year, because certain things require time if they are to be prepared properly. Nikitas observed that as an idea it was insane, and Bottolino answered that, nevertheless, it had worked. And he looked at Nikitas with pride. It's only natural, Nikitas thought. Your vanity is boundless, you have even made Charlemagne a saint. From Bottolino anything could be expected. And after that? He asked. While Frederick and Reynald were preparing to canonize Charlemagne, little by little I realized that neither he nor the Magi were enough. All four of them were safely in paradise. At least the Magi surely were, and we could hope for Charlemagne as well, otherwise at Aix-la-Chapelle we'd made a fine mess. But still it took something more, here on this earth, where the emperor could say, here I am, and this sanctions my power. And the only thing the emperor could find on this earth was the kingdom of Prester John. 11. Bottolino constructs a palace for Prester John. On the Friday morning, 3 of the Genoese, Pevera, Boimondo, and Grillo, came to confirm what could very clearly be seen even from a distance. The fire had gone out, as if by itself, because nobody had taken much trouble to fight it. But this did not mean they could now venture into Constantinople. On the contrary, enabled to move more easily through the streets and squares, the pilgrims had intensified their search for wealthy citizens, and amid the still warm ruins they demolished while little remained standing, searching for those treasures that had eluded the first looting. Nikitas sighed, disconsolate, and asked for some Samos wine. He also wanted them to toast for him, in just a hint of oil, some sesame seeds that he could chew slowly between sips, and then he asked also for some walnuts and pistachios, the better to follow the story that he invited Bottolino to continue. One day the poet was sent by Reynald on some mission to Paris, and he took advantage of the occasion to return to the delights of the taverns with Bottolino and Abdul. He also met Boron, but those fantasies about the earthly paradise seemed to hold little interest for him. The years spent at court had changed him, Bottolino noted. He had hardened, he never ceased clinking cups gaily, but he seemed to control himself, to shun excess, to remain on his guard, like someone lying in wait for his prey, ready to spring. Bottolino, he said one day, you are wasting time. What was to be learned here in Paris, we have learned. But all these great doctors would shit in their pants if tomorrow I presented myself at a dispute in full ministerial regalia, with a sword at my side. At court I have learned a few things. If you are with great men, you also become great. Great men in reality are very small. Power is everything, and there is no reason why one day you could not seize it yourself, at least in part. You must know how to wait, of course, but not let your opportunity escape. However, he promptly pricked up his ears when he heard that his friends were still talking about Prester John. When he had left them in Paris that story still seemed a fantasy of bookworms, but in Milan he had heard Bottolino speak of it to Reynald as of something that could become a visible sign of the imperial power, at least as much as the rediscovery of the Magi. The enterprise, in that case, would interest him, and he began taking part in it as if he were constructing a war machine. The more they talked about it, the more it seemed to him that the land of Prester John, like an earthly Jerusalem, was being transformed from a place of mystical pilgrimage to a land of conquest. So he reminded his comrades that, after the Magi business, the priest had become far more important than before. He had to be presented truly as Rex et Sacerdos. As king of kings he had to have a palace compared to which those of the Christian sovereigns, including the basileus of the Constantinople schismatics, would seem hovels, and as priest he had to have a temple compared to which the churches of the Pope were shacks. He had to be given a worthy palace. There is a model, Boron said, and it is the heavenly Jerusalem as the Apostle John saw it in the Apocalypse. It must be girded by high walls, with 12 gates, like the 12 tribes of Israel, to the south 3 gates, to the west 3 gates, to the east 3 gates, and to the north 3 gates. Yes, the poet jested, and the priest enters one and goes out the other, and when there is a storm they all slam at once. I can imagine the drafts. In a palace like that you would never find me, not even dead. Let me continue. The foundations of the walls are of jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sardonyx, sard, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprase, hyacinth, and amethyst, and the 12 gates are 12 pearls, and the forecourt is pure gold, transparent as glass. Not bad, Abdul said, but I think the model must be the Temple of Jerusalem, as the prophet Ezekiel describes it. Come with me tomorrow morning to the abbey. One of the canons, the learned Richard of Saint Victoire, is trying to reconstruct the design of the temple, since the text of the prophet is at times obscure. Master Nikitas, Bottolino said, I don't know if you've ever studied the measurements of the temple. Not yet. Well, don't, because it's enough to drive you crazy. In the Book of Kings it says that the temple is 60 cubits wide, 30 high, and 20 deep, and that the porch is 20 wide and 10 cubits deep. In Chronicles, however, it is said that the porch is 120 cubits high. Now, if it were 20 wide, 120 high, and 10 deep, not only would the porch be 4 times higher than all the temple, but it would also be so flimsy that it would fall down in a mere breath. The problem, however, arises when you read the vision of Ezekiel. Not one measurement holds up, and so a number of pious men have admitted that Ezekiel had indeed had a vision, which is a bit like saying he had drunk too much and was seeing double. Nothing wrong with that, poor Ezekiel, he also had a right to his fun, but then that Richard of Saint Victoire reasoned as follows. If everything, every number, every straw in the Bible has a spiritual meaning, we must clearly understand what it says literally, because it's one thing to say, for the spiritual meaning, that something is 3 long and another's length is 9, since these two numbers have different mystical meanings. I can't describe to you the scene when we went to hear Richard's lecture on the temple. He had the book of Ezekiel before his eyes, and he was working with a tape to demonstrate all the measurements. He drew the outline of what Ezekiel had described, then he took some sticks and little slabs of soft wood and, with the help of his acolytes, he cut them and tried to put them together with nails and glue. He tried to reconstruct the temple, and he reduced the measurements proportionally. What I mean is that where Ezekiel said 1 cubit, he had a finger's width cut. Every 2 minutes the whole thing collapsed. Richard became angry with his helpers, saying they had let go of the stick, or hadn't put on enough glue. They defended themselves, saying that he was the one who had given them the wrong measurements. Then the master corrected himself, saying that perhaps the text said porta, but in this case the word meant porch, otherwise there would be a door almost as big as the whole temple. At other moments he reversed himself, and said that when 2 measurements didn't agree it was because the first time Ezekiel was referring to the dimension of the whole building and the second to the measurement of 1 part. Or else sometimes it said cubit but it meant geometric cubit, which is equal to 6 ordinary cubits. In other words, it was amusing for a few mornings to follow that sainted man as he racked his brains, and we burst out laughing every time the temple came apart. To keep him from noticing, we pretended to pick up some fallen object, but then a canon realized we were always dropping things, and he sent us away. In the days that followed, Abdul suggested that, as Ezekiel after all belonged to the people of Israel, perhaps others of his faith could shed some light. When his companions, shocked, said that it was not right to read the scriptures while asking advice of a Jew, since notoriously that treacherous race altered the text of the sacred books to remove every reference to the coming of Christ, Abdul revealed that some of the greatest masters in Paris took advantage at times, though in secret, of the learning of the rabbis, at least for those passages where the coming of the Messiah was not involved. As luck would have it, in those very days, the Saint Victoire canons had invited to their abbey one such man, still young but of great reputation, Solomon of Girona. Naturally Solomon was not staying at Saint Victoire. The canons had found him a room, dark and fetid, in one of the shabbiest streets of Paris. He was, indeed, a young man, even though his face seemed haggard from meditation and study. He expressed himself in good Latin, but in an almost incomprehensible fashion, because he had a peculiar mouth. In the whole left side he had all his teeth, upper and lower, from the central incisor, but no teeth on the right side. Though it was morning, the darkness of the room obliged him to read with a burning lamp, and on the arrival of his visitors, he put his hands on a scroll he had before him as if to prevent others from peering at it. A futile precaution, because the scroll was written in Hebrew characters. The rabbi tried to apologize because, he said, that was a book that Christians rightly execrated, the ill-famed Toledat Geschu, in which it was said that Jesus was the son of a courtesan and a mercenary, a certain Pantera. But the Saint Victoire canons themselves had asked him to translate a few pages, because they wanted to understand the extent of the Jews' perfidy. He said that he would undertake the task willingly because he also considered the book too severe, and as much as Jesus was surely a virtuous man, even if he had had the weakness to consider himself, wrongly, the Messiah, but perhaps he had been deceived by the Prince of Darkness, and even the Gospels admitted that the prince had come to tempt him. He was questioned about the form of the temple according to Ezekiel, and he smiled. The most alert commentators on the sacred text have not succeeded in establishing the exact structure of the temple. Even the great Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac admitted that, if you follow the letter of the text, there is no understanding where the northern external chambers are, where they begin to the west, and how far they stretch to the east, and so on. You Christians do not understand that the sacred text is born from a voice. The Lord, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that the Holy One, may his name always be blessed, when he speaks to his prophets, allows them to hear sounds, but does not show figures, as you people do, with your illuminated pages. The voice surely provokes images in the heart of the prophet, but these images are not immobile. They liquefy, change shape according to the melody of that voice, and if you want to reduce to images the voice of the Lord, blessed always be his name, you freeze that voice, as if it were fresh water turning to ice that no longer quenches thirst, but numbs the limbs in the chill of death. Canon Richard, to understand the spiritual meaning of each part of the temple, would like to reconstruct it, as a master mason would do, and he will never succeed. Visions are like dreams, where things are transformed one into another, not like the images of your church, where things remain always the same. Then Rabbi Solomon asked why his visitors wanted to know what the temple was like, and they told him of their search for the kingdom of Prester John. The rabbi showed great interest. Perhaps you do not know, he said, that our texts also tell us of a mysterious kingdom in the Far East, where the scattered 10 tribes of Israel still live. I have heard these tribes spoken of, Baudolino said, but I know very little of them. It is all written. After the death of King Solomon, the 12 tribes into which Israel was then divided fell to fighting. Only two, that of Judah and that of Benjamin, remained loyal to the house of David, and 10 whole tribes went north, where they were defeated and enslaved by the Assyrians. Of them nothing more was heard. Esdras says that they went towards a land never inhabited by man, in a region called Arsareth, and other prophets have announced that one day they would be found and would make a triumphal return to Jerusalem. Now, one of our brothers, Eldad of the tribe of Dan, more than 100 years ago, arrived at Kairouan, in Africa, where a community of the chosen people exists, saying that he came from the kingdom of the 10 lost tribes, a land blessed by heaven, where life is peaceful, never troubled by any crime, where truly the streams flow with milk and honey. This land has remained separated from every other country because it is defended by the river Sambadion, which is as wide as the shot of the mightiest bow, but it is without water, and only sand and stones flow there furiously, making a noise so horrible that it can be heard even at the distance of a day's march, and that inanimate matter flows there so rapidly that anyone wishing to cross the river would be swept away by it. That stony course stops only at the beginning of the Sabbath, and only on the Sabbath can it be crossed, but no son of Israel could violate the Sabbath day of rest. But Christians could? Asked Abdul. No, because on the Sabbath a hedge of flames makes the banks of the river inaccessible. Then how did that Eldad reach Africa? The poet asked. This I do not know, but who am I to dispute the decrees of the Lord, the Holy One be he ever blessed? Men of little faith, Eldad may have been born by an angel. The problem for our rabbis, who immediately began arguing about that account, from Babylon to Spain, was rather something else. If the 10 lost tribes had lived by the divine law, their laws should have been the same as Israel's, whereas according to Eldad's story they were different. But if the kingdom Eldad tells of was the realm of Prester John, Baudolino said, then its laws would truly be different from yours, but similar to ours, even better. This is what divides us from you Gentiles, Rabbi Solomon said. You have the freedom to practice your law, and you have corrupted it, so you seek a place where it is still observed. We have kept our law intact, but we haven't the freedom to follow it. In any case, you should know that it would also be my desire to find that kingdom, because it could be that our 10 lost tribes and the Gentiles live there in peace and harmony, each free to follow his own law, and the very existence of that prodigious kingdom would be an example to all the children of the Almighty, may his holy name be always blessed. And further, I must tell you I would like to find that kingdom for another reason. According to what Eldad said, the holy language is still spoken there, the original language that the Almighty, blessed always be his name, had given to Adam, and which was lost with the construction of the Tower of Babel. What folly, Abdul said. My mother always told me that the language of Adam was reconstructed on her island, and it is the Gaelic language, composed of 9 parts of speech, the same number as the 9 materials from which the Tower of Babel was built, clay and water, wool and blood, wood and mortar, pitch, linen, and bitumen. It was the 72 sages of the school of Phineas who constructed the Gaelic language, using fragments of all the 72 tongues born after the confusion of tongues, and for this reason Gaelic contains what is best in every language, and since the Adamitic language has the same form as the created world, so each noun in it expresses the essence of the very thing it denotes. Rabbi Solomon smiled indulgently. Many nations believe that theirs is the language of Adam, forgetting that Adam could speak only the language of the Torah, not of those books that tell of false and lying gods. The 72 languages born after the Great Confusion are ignorant of fundamental letters. For example, the Gentiles do not know the letter Het and the Arabs are unaware of Pei, and hence such languages resemble the grunting of swine, the croaking of frogs, or the cry of the crane, because they belong to peoples who have abandoned the true way of life. The original Torah, at the moment of the creation, was before the Almighty, always may his name be blessed, written like black fire upon white fire, not in order of the written Torah as we read it today, and which was manifested only after Adam's sin. For this reason every night I spend hours and hours spelling out, with great concentration, the letters of the written Torah, to confuse them, to make them spin like the wheel of a mill, and thus cause to reappear the original order of the eternal Torah, which pre-existed creation and had been given to the angels by the Almighty, blessed be his name always. If I knew that a distant kingdom exists where the original order is preserved, as well as the language that Adam spoke with his Creator before committing his sin, I would gladly devote my life to seeking it. As Solomon said these words, his countenance was illuminated by such a light that our friends asked themselves if it were not worth having him share in their future discussions. It was the poet who found the decisive argument, the fact that this Jew wanted to find in the kingdom of Prester John his language and his 10 tribes should not disturb them. Prester John had to be so powerful that he could govern even the lost tribes of the Jews, and there seemed to be no reason why he should not also speak the language of Adam. The chief question was, first of all, how to construct that kingdom, and to that end a Jew could be as useful as a Christian. Nevertheless, they still had not decided what John's palace should be like. They resolved the question some nights later, the 5 of them in Baudolino's room. Inspired by the genius of the place, Abdul made up his mind to reveal to his new friends the secret of the green honey, saying that it could help them not to imagine but, rather, to see Prester John's palace directly. Rabbi Solomon said at once that he knew far more mystical methods to provoke visions, and that at night he had only to murmur the multiple combinations of the letters of the secret name of the Lord, spinning them on his tongue, until a whirl of thoughts and of images was born, whereupon he plunged into a blissful exhaustion. The poet at first seemed suspicious, then he determined to try, but, wishing to temper the property of the honey with that of wine, in the end he lost all restraint and raved better than the others. Having reached the proper state of intoxication, and helping himself with a few unsteady lines that he drew on the table, dipping his finger into the jar, he suggested that the palace had to be like the one the Apostle Thomas had built for Gondopharos, king of the Indians. Ceilings and beams of cypress wood, roof of ebony, and a dome surmounted by 2 golden apples, on each of which gleamed 2 carbuncles, so that the gold shone during the day by the light of the sun and the gems at night in the glow of the moon. Then he stopped relying on his memory and on the authority of Thomas, and began seeing doors of sardonyx mixed with horns of the cerastes, which prevent passers-by from introducing poison into the building, and windows of crystal, tables of gold on columns of ivory, lights nourished with balsam, and the king's bed of sapphire, to preserve chastity, because, the poet concluded, this John may be a king all right, but he is also a priest, and so, as for women, nothing doing. It seems beautiful to me, Bottolino said, but for a king who rules over such a vast land, I would also put, in some hall, those automata that I've heard existed in Rome, that gave warning when one of the provinces was in revolt. In the priest's kingdom, I don't believe, Abdul remarked, that there can be revolts, because peace and harmony reign there. However, the idea of the automata appealed to him, because everyone knows that a great emperor, whether Moor or Christian, had to have automata at court. So he saw them, and with wonderful hypotyposes he made them visible also to his friends. The palace stands on a mountain, and it's the mountain that is made of onyx, with a peak so smooth that it shines like the moon. The temple is round, its dome is of gold, and the walls, too, are of gold, encrusted with gems so rudolent that they produce warmth in winter and coolness in summer. The ceiling is encrusted with sapphires that represent the sky and carbuncles that represent the stars. A gilded sun and a silvered moon, these are the automata, travel through the heavenly vault, and mechanical birds sing every day, while at the corners 4 bronze angels accompany them with their trumpets. The palace rises over a hidden well, in which teams of horses move a grindstone, making it turn according to the changes of the seasons, so that it becomes the image of the cosmos. Beneath the crystal floor fish swim, and fabulous marine creatures. However, I have heard talk of mirrors from which you can see all the things that happen. One would be most useful, for John, to survey the extreme confines of his realm. The poet, by now thinking in terms of architecture, began drawing the mirror, explaining, it will be set very high, and can be reached by ascending a flight of 125 steps of porphyry. And alabaster, Boron suggested, who until then had been silently cherishing the effect of the green honey. All right, we'll add alabaster. And the highest steps will be of amber and panther. What's this panther? The father of Jesus? Bottolino asked. Don't be foolish, Pliny mentions it. It's a multicolored stone. But actually the mirror rests on a single pilaster. Actually, no, it doesn't. This pilaster supports a plinth on which stand 2 pilasters, and these support a base on which stand 4 pilasters, and so the pilasters increase until on the central base there are 64. These support a base with 32 pilasters, which support a base with 16 pilasters, and so they diminish until you come to a single pilaster that supports the mirror. Listen, Rabbi Solomon said, with this pilaster business the mirror will fall down the moment you set it on its base. You shut up. You're as false as the soul of Judas. For you it's fine when your Ezekiel sees a temple and we know nothing about its form. If a Christian Mason comes and tells you it couldn't stand up, you answer that Ezekiel heard voices and wasn't paying attention to the figures, so then I have to make only mirrors that will stand on their feet? All right, I'll also put 12,000 armed guards around the mirror, at the base of the column, and they'll see that it stands up. All right, it's your mirror, Rabbi Solomon said, conciliatory. Abdul followed this talk, smiling, his eyes lost in empty space, and Bottolino realized that in the mirror Abdul would have liked to glimpse at least the shadow of his distant princess. In the days that followed we had to make haste because the poet had to leave again, and he didn't want to miss the rest of the story, Bottolino said to Nikitas. But by now we were on the right track. On the right track? But this priest was, in my opinion, less credible than the Magi dressed as cardinals and Charlemagne amid the heavenly host. The priest would become credible if he made himself known, with a personal letter to Frederick. 12. Bottolino writes the letter of Prester John. The decision to write a letter of Prester John was inspired by a story that Rabbi Solomon had heard from the Arabs of Spain. A sailor, Sindbad, who lived in the time of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, was shipwrecked one day on an island, along the line of the equinox, where both day and night last exactly 12 hours. Sindbad said he had seen many Indians on the island, and so the island was close to India. The Indians took him into the presence of the Prince of Sarandib. This prince moved only on a throne, mounted on an elephant, 8 cubits high, and on either side, in double file, marched his vassals and his ministers. He was preceded by a herald with a golden javelin, and behind him came a second herald with a golden mace, an emerald at its apex. When the prince descended from the throne to continue on horseback, he was followed by 1,000 horsemen dressed in silk and brocade, and yet another herald preceded him, crying that a king was arriving who possessed a crown such as Solomon had never had. The prince granted Sindbad audience, asking him many questions about the kingdom from whence he came. Finally the prince asked him to bear a letter to Harun al-Rashid, written on sheepskin parchment with ultramarine ink, which said, I send you the greeting of peace, I, Prince of Sarandib, before whom stand 1,000 elephants, and in whose palace the battlements are made of jewels. We consider you a brother and we beg you to send us a reply. And we beg you to accept this humble gift. The humble gift was an enormous ruby goblet, its bowl adorned with pearls. This gift and that letter increased throughout the Saracen world the veneration of the name of the great Harun al-Rashid. That sailor of yours was surely in the kingdom of Prester John, Bottolino said. Though in Arabic they call it by a different name. But he lied in saying that the priest sent letters and gifts to the caliph, because John is Christian, even if a Nestorian, and if he had sent a letter, it would have been to the Emperor Frederick. Then let's write that letter ourselves, the poet said. In seeking any information that could enhance their construction of Prester John's kingdom, our friends encountered Kayat. He was a young native of Champagne, who had just returned from a journey in Brittany, his spirit still aflame with stories of errant knights, wizards, fairies, and spells, which the inhabitants of those lands tell in the evening around the fire. When Bottolino mentioned to him the wonders of Prester John's palace, the youth cried out, "Why, in Brittany I heard tell of such a castle, or almost. It's where the Grazel is kept. What do you know about the Grazel?" Boron asked, turning suspicious immediately, as if Kayat had laid a hand on something that was his property. "Well then," Bottolino said, "I see that this object means a lot to both of you. What is it?" "As far as I know, a Grazel, or Gradulus, is some kind of bowl." "Bowl? Bowl." Boron smiled indulgently. "More of a chalice." Then, as if making up his mind to reveal his secret, he went on, "I'm amazed you haven't heard of it. It is the most precious relic of all Christianity, the cup in which Jesus consecrated the wine at the Last Supper, and in which later Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood that flowed from the ribs of Christ on the cross. Some say that the name of that cup is the Holy Grail, others say it is Sangrail, royal blood, because he who possesses it becomes one of the chosen knights, of the same lineage as David and our Lord." "Grail or Grazel?" the poet asked, immediately alert, hearing of something that could confer some kind of power. "We don't know," Kayat said. "Some also say Graal, and it may not necessarily be a bowl. Those who have seen it do not recall the shape. All we know is that it is an object endowed with extraordinary powers." "Who has seen it?" the poet asked. "Surely the knights who guarded it in Broceliande. But every trace of them has also been lost, and I have met only people who tell of them." "It would be better if they told about that thing less and tried to learn more," Boron said. "That boy's been to Brittany, he's barely heard it mentioned, and he's already looking at me as if I wanted to steal from him what he doesn't have. That's how it is with everybody. You hear talk of the Grazel, and you think you'll be the one to find it. But I've spent 5 years in Brittany, and in the islands beyond the sea, without telling stories, only to find." "And did you find it?" Kayat asked. "The problem wasn't to find the Grazel, but to find the knights who knew where it is. I traveled, I asked questions, I never encountered them. Maybe I wasn't one of the chosen. And here I am, rummaging among parchments, hoping to uncover a clue that escaped me while I was roaming in those forests. Now why are we here talking about the Grazel?" Bottolino said. "Whether it's in Brittany or in those islands, it doesn't concern us, because it has nothing to do with Prester John." "No," Kayat said, "because where the castle is and the nature of the object it houses have never been clear, but among the many stories he had heard there was one according to which one of those knights, Pherophes, had found it and given it to his son, a priest who was to become king of India." "Nonsense," Boron said. "Would I then have searched for years in the wrong place? Who told you the story of this Pherophes?" "Any story can be valid," the poet said, "and if you follow Kayat's you might find your Grazel. But for the moment the question is not to find it, but to establish if it's worth connecting to Prester John. My dear Boron, we're not seeking a thing. We're seeking someone who will tell us about it." Then he turned to Bottolino. "What do you think? Does Prester John possess the Grazel? Is that the source of his great distinction, and could he transmit that distinction to Frederick, making him a gift of it? And could it be the same ruby cup that the Prince of Sarandib had sent to Harun al-Rashid?" suggested Solomon, who in his excitement had begun to speak through the toothless side of his mouth. "The Saracens honor Jesus as a great prophet. They could have discovered the cup, and then Harun might, in turn, have given it to the priest." "Splendid," the poet said. "The cup is harbinger of the reconquest of what the Moors had held as unjust possessors. Better than Jerusalem." They decided to try. During the night Abdul managed to remove from the scriptorium of Saint Victoire a parchment of great value, never scraped. It lacked only a seal to make it seem the letter of a king. In that room meant for 2 people, which now housed 6 around a rickety table, Bottolino, his eyes closed, dictated as if inspired. Abdul wrote, because his calligraphy, which he had learned in the Christian kingdoms beyond the sea, could suggest the way an Oriental would write Latin letters. Before beginning, he had proposed, so that all would be suitably clever and inventive, emptying the pot of the remaining green honey, but Bottolino objected. This evening, they had to have clear minds. They promptly asked themselves if the priest should not write in his Adamic language, or at least in Greek, but it was decided that a king like John probably had at his service secretaries who knew every language, and out of respect for Frederick, he would write in Latin. Also because, Bottolino added, the letter was intended to amaze and convince the Pope and the other Christian princes, and therefore it had, first of all, to be comprehensible to them. They set to work. The priest Johannes, by the power and grace of God and of our Lord Jesus Christ, master of all those who rule, to Frederick, Holy and Roman Emperor, wishing him good health and perpetual enjoyment of the divine benediction. It has been announced to our majesty that you held in great esteem our excellency, and that word of our greatness has reached you. Also we have learned from our emissaries that you wish to send us some pleasing and entertaining gift, to delight our clemency. Gladly we accept the gift, and through our ambassador we send you a token, on our part, as we desire to know if you follow, as we do, the true faith, and if you believe completely in our Lord Jesus Christ. In the breadth of our munificence, if you desire something that can procure for you pleasure, inform us, either by a word to our messenger or by a sign of your affection. Except in exchange. Stop a moment, Abdul said. This could be the point where the priest sends Frederick the Grazel. Yes, Badalino said, but these two nitwits Boron and Kayat haven't yet managed to tell us what it is. They've heard so many stories, they've seen so many things, maybe they don't remember everything. That's why I suggested the honey. We have to encourage the flow of ideas. Yes, perhaps Badalino, who was dictating, and Abdul, who was writing, could limit themselves to wine. But the witnesses, or the sources of the revelation, had to be stimulated with green honey. And thus after a few moments Boron, Kayat, stupefied by the new sensations he was experiencing, and the poet, who had now developed a taste for the honey, were seated on the floor with foolish smiles engraved on their faces, raving like so many hostages of Elodin. Oh, yes, Kayat was saying, there is a great hall, and torches that illuminated with a brightness beyond anything imaginable. An attendant appears grasping a spear of such whiteness that it shines in the glow of the fireplace. From the tip of the spear comes a drop of blood and it drips on the hand of the attendant. Then 2 other attendants arrive with honey gold candelabra, in each of which at least 10 candles are alight. The candles pale, as do the moon and the stars when the sun rises. The Grazel is made of purest gold, studded with extraordinary precious stones, the rarest that exist on land or in the sea. And now another maiden enters, carrying a silver dish. So what's this damn Grazel like? The poet cried. I don't know. I see only a light. You see only a light, Boron said, but I see more. There are torches illuminating the hall, true, but now thunder is heard, a terrible shaking, as if the palace were collapsing. A great darkness falls. No, now a ray of sunlight illuminates the palace, 7 times brighter than before. Oh, the holy Grazel is entering, covered with a cloth of white velvet, and as it enters, the palace is filled with the perfumes of all the spices of the world. Gradually, as the Grazel moves around the table, the knights see their plates fill with all the foods they could desire. But what's this Grazel like? Devil take it, don't curse. It's a cup. How do you know if it's under a velvet cloth? I know because I know, Boron said stubbornly. They told me, may you be damned through the centuries and tormented by 1,000 demons. You seem to have a vision, and then you tell us what you've been told and can't see? Why, you're worse than that asshole Ezekiel, who didn't know what he was seeing because those Jews never look at pictures and only hear voices. Please, you blasphemer, Solomon interjected, not just for my sake. The Bible is a holy book also for you, you loathsome Gentiles. Calm yourselves, Badalino said. Now listen to this, Boron. We'll assume that the Grazel is the cup that held the wine our Lord blessed. How could Joseph of Arimathea